Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Justice and Witness Action Network Maryland campaign launch for environment and climate justice as we prepare to get ready for the upcoming Maryland 2023 legislative session. We wanted to gather together our leaders across our churches in Maryland who have agreed to prioritize the environment and climate justice as a focus of our work this year. I'm excited that we have a number of leaders in the environmental and climate justice community with us this evening to share a little bit about their work, but also to educate us about some important issues that we should be prioritizing as part of our collective work as a faith community this year in the state of Maryland. By way of introduction, I want to encourage each of you to take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat. If you haven't already done that, please give us your name, your local church, and if you know your association. Also, by way of introduction, let me just provide a brief background for those who may not know as of yet. As we try to do in any gathering, we want to make sure that you are knowledgeable about who we are as a Justice and Witness Action Network. Overall, the Justice and Witness Action Network is a ministry of the Central Atlantic Conference, and we are organized not only by issue-based networks, but also by state and regional networks. So we look to organize and mobilize our local churches, leaders, and clergy by regions, by state, so that we can collectively do the work of justice, both around public policy advocacy and in other areas as well. And many of you are quite familiar with our extensive work that we've been doing over the last 2 years since 2020 around our Faith and Democracy campaign, which is a civic engagement campaign to engage citizens in the important task of participating in our electoral process. This evening, we have a few leaders with us who are going to provide an overview of the legislative session, particularly around issues of the environment that will be important. I'm happy that we have Jonathan Lancock Ninsley, who's the Director of Faithful Advocacy with Interfaith Power and Light, DC, Maryland, and Northern Virginia. We also have one of our own, of course, John Cassender, who is serving as our environment and climate justice organizer with the network. He'll speak a little bit about the updates and the progress we'll be making around our Mid-Atlantic Air Quality Collaborative. And then finally, we will hear from Nina Beth Carden, who's the co-founder and director of the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights. And many of you remember last year, we had an opportunity to participate in that campaign. Although we weren't quite as successful in terms of the goal of passing legislation, getting an initiative put on the ballot for voters to consider, but there's still work to be done so that we can reach that ultimate goal. And we will hear updates from her on what's next for that campaign this year. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Jonathan, so you can maybe share a little bit more about yourself and then jump right on into your presentations.
Sure. Thanks so much. It's great to be with you all. I'm Jonathan Laycock Nisley. I'm the Director of Faithful Advocacy for Interfaith Power and Light. At Interfaith Power and Light, we focus on connecting people from many different faith communities to a religious response to climate change. And we cover the full state of Maryland, as well as DC and Northern Virginia. For the past 2 years at Interfaith Power and Light, we've been focused on what we've called turning away from burning. So turning away from burning fossil fuels everywhere that they're found, but especially looking at the fossil fuels in our buildings. And so this year, I'll share some slides here. To continue that work this year, we are focused on reforming the Empower Maryland program. Let me get this full screen. So I'll say more about what Empower Maryland is and the changes we're trying to make in a minute. But first, I just want to make sure that I share a little bit about this larger problem that we're trying to address, which is the fossil fuels in our buildings. So when we talk about burning fossil fuels in our buildings, in our homes, our businesses, our houses of worship, the most common fossil fuel we're talking about is methane gas, or what's often called natural gas. And we burn this, I burn this at home. I have a gas stove and a gas furnace and a gas water heater. And some of you may have gas dryers as well. And gas was given to us as the clean fossil fuel. We were told that this was supposed to be a bridge to help us get to renewable energy. But unfortunately, it turns out that couldn't be further from the truth. When we look at the climate impacts of methane gas, when it escapes into the atmosphere without being burned, has about 80 times the warming power of carbon dioxide. And this gas, this is the utility gas that's pumped under our streets. It's leaking constantly. So methane gas is not the clean fossil fuel. It actually has a really big climate impact that we need to be concerned about. And last year, as part of the Climate Solutions Now Act, which I'm guessing some of you helped advocate for as well, the General Assembly set some really ambitious and really important climate goals for the state of Maryland. And we can't meet those climate goals if we continue burning fossil fuels at home. But beyond these climate impacts, we know that there are many more reasons we need to stop burning gas in our buildings. Our gas furnaces, our gas water heaters, our gas stoves are a huge source of indoor air pollution. Some public health experts have compared having a gas stove in your kitchen to having an idling car inside your house. And studies have shown that children growing up in a home with a gas stove are 42% more likely to develop asthma symptoms. That's a really hard fact to absorb. It's especially hard because, this is impacting those communities, especially low-income households and Black and brown communities that have already been forced to deal with an unfair burden of air pollution. And the myths that we've been told around gas stoves and how safe they are contributing to that burden. Our gas appliances are also a looming affordability disaster. The Maryland Office of the People's Council released a report this past fall projecting that over the next decade or so, utility gas prices will double or triple. And they say that by the middle of this century, by 2050, utility gas prices will have increased 7 to 11 times over. So these high home heating bills are also a serious equity issue. And we need to make sure that lower income Marylanders are among the first to have the opportunity to switch to all electric appliances and not the last. So that's the second part of this larger story on gas. We now have the affordable, efficient, all-electric alternatives to do this job. We have induction electric stoves, which use electromagnetism to heat our food with that same precision of gas, but without the dangerous pollution. We have electric heat pumps, which function as both an air conditioner, but then can function also as an air conditioner in reverse. So one efficient unit doing heating and cooling. And that same heat pump technology is also now available in water heaters. So this is where the Empower Maryland program comes in. Empower Maryland is the utility-run home energy efficiency program. It's been around for 15 years now, and over that time, it's helped Marylanders save almost $13 billion on their utility bills. So it currently does really good work on home energy audits and weatherization work. So that's kind of helping us check up on our energy use at home. And we like to say putting a sweater on our draftier buildings, filling in the nooks and crannies, blowing insulation into attics. The important kind of unrecognized work of lowering our utility bills and saving energy. But crucially, right now, Empower can't help people get off of fossil fuels. And it's actually locking people into fossil fuels for more years to come. So I just went through the Empower program at home myself this past fall, and someone came out to my home and did a blower test. They had a big fan at the front door, and they marked off the places where air was seeping into my house. And they put together a really great plan for me to get more insulation and lower my bills that way. But the other piece of what they offered me was rebates to buy all new gas appliances. They said, oh, you can get some money back for buying a new gas stove. And they weren't able to offer me any money back on buying the electric appliances that we know we need to be moving to. So that's a problem. And that is where our bill comes in, where what we're trying to do in reforming the Empower program. So first of all, our bill sets a goal of cutting climate pollution. We're going to measure how well the Empower program is doing each year, in part by looking at how much it cuts climate pollution. And that's actually something that the Public Service Commission, which is the public body that monitors the Empower program, has asked for, because our old way of measuring energy savings doesn't line up anymore with our climate goals. The second thing our bill does is that it stops spending ratepayer money on those fossil fuel appliances. We just cannot be spending our limited efficiency dollars on forms of energy that we know are unhealthy and increasingly unaffordable. Third, this bill will help provide rebates to people who want to move off of fossil fuels. So it'll help people buy those electric appliances like electric heat pumps and induction stoves and heat pump water heaters. And finally, this bill will help make sure that low-income households can take advantage of the Empower program, and also all of the new federal funds that are available by setting up a community outreach program with multilingual outreach specialists. So besides these changes we want to make to the Empower program, there's also a ton of new federal money available, both through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. And all of that funding is also focused on helping people electrify at home. So we want low-income households to know about all of the options that are available to them. So now is the time to pass this bill, in part because of all that new federal money. All of that new federal money is focused on helping people make this switch from fossil fuel appliances to electric ones. And so if Maryland's programs aren't aligned, in part, we're making people choose. You can either have the federal money or the state money. We know that many households, especially lower income households, are going to need both to make this transition. And we don't want to leave that federal money on the table. The second reason that this is a great time to pass this bill, Delegate Charkoudian, Lloyd Charkoudian from Montgomery County, has been bringing a low-income energy efficiency bill for several years. This bill passed both chambers last year before being vetoed by the governor. That bill is essential to ensuring that low-income households get their fair share of Empower funding. And we want to see it passed quickly this year into law. We're feeling good about that since both chambers passed it last time. We have a new governor who should be excited to sign this into law. But that low-income energy efficiency bill can work hand in hand with this Empower reform effort that we're bringing, because as low-income households are getting their fair share, we want to make sure that they can use that money to buy healthier all-electric appliances and not be trapped into more years of gas stoves. So I will break now to see what questions folks have, but the last thing I'll say, and I think we're going to mention more about this later, is that later this month, we're partnering with Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake and a number of other local faith and climate organizations in doing a Maryland legislative briefing. So you can hear more about Empower and other faith and climate priorities at that briefing, and I'll drop the registration link into the chat here.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Why don't we go ahead and open it up for any questions that anyone may have? Please be sure to introduce yourself. Any questions?
Well, I've got one. I'll start us off. I know, Jonathan, you and I have talked about this, but for the benefit of the group assembled, what are the particular stumbling blocks? Who were the particular stumbling blocks in the legislature? Just on the off chance that anyone here finds themselves a constituent of somebody that's going to be a real wedge here, it probably is worth naming who they are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also should have named that our House sponsor is Delegate Lily Chee in Montgomery County, and our Senate sponsor is Senator Karen Lewis Young in Frederick County. So those are a couple of the champions on this bill. So this bill is going to be going through the Economic Matters Committee on the House side, which can sometimes be a place where members have a lot of questions about climate legislation. And so if your delegate or one of your delegates is on that committee, it's always a great time to reach out to them and say that you care about the Empower program and low-income energy efficiency. Several members that we especially are wanting to get this message to are the chair, Delegate C.T. Wilson in Charles County. And then I'll just quickly I'll actually just drop into the chat a list of some other delegates. It would be great if you are a constituent to reach out to.
And for those who are wondering who your constituents or who your elected representatives are in the Maryland State House, we will help you with that. So a number of ways we can get that information to you. Hugh, you had your hand raised. You have a question for Jonathan?
I'm sorry I came in a little late. What solar and wind? We're seeing around in our neighborhood now a number of houses going to the solar panels, and I frankly don't understand it completely, how that works. So what about solar and what's going on with the wind farm out off of Ocean City? Does that help impact any of this?
It does. So there's also legislation coming this session, one to make permanent the community solar program. That's kind of the big solar bill this session. And there's another bill on offshore wind. So to help the connections there go more smoothly. Currently, each company that sets up turbines offshore has to run their own line all the way to shore to make connections. And so one of the things that the offshore wind bill would do is set up a connecting point out in the ocean. So all of those companies can be connecting at the same spot.
Can we also help those bills as they are coming up this session? How would be the best way for us to let those? I live very close to the Chesapeake Bay, so and that's not far from the ocean. And can we help those other bills get further along too?
That's great. Yeah, the community solar bill we'll be talking about at our legislative briefing later in the month. And the offshore wind bill, the Chesapeake Climate Action Network is leading efforts on that. I've not been as involved there, but their website has lots of resources on that legislation.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions for Jonathan? I have one question, Jonathan. You mentioned the low-income energy is, I think it was other bill.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think legislators would look at that bill in comparison to Empower? Would they see them as sort of competing bills? I know that our perspective, or your perspective, as you mentioned, that they can be sort of complementary bills, but do you think legislators will see that and say, hey, well, this got passed last year, let's just do this, not worry about Empower right now? Do you think we would have any of that type of thinking out there amongst those in the House or the Senate?
I hope not. Delegate Charkoudian sees them also as complementary and is talking about them both. And I think there's an important story to be told, and I think you all can help in telling it, that these are two separate issues that work together. There's the one issue of ensuring that low-income households get their fair share of efficiency funding. And there's this other piece of ensuring that our efficiency dollars are being put to the best use they can be. So obviously those two things work together. Like low-income households need to be getting the best kind of bang for their buck on the efficiency dollar. But yeah, I think that's something to look out for. I think we need to ensure that we are telling the full story to legislators.
Can you also talk a little bit about so the ways in which we could be impactful? I know that, there's hearings that are held on the bills. I know that there will be opportunities to sort of rally and sort of generate sort of public support and show that there's public support for this. But where do you see sort of us as the faith community, particularly United Church of Christ, where we could sort of plug in and have an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're able to submit testimony on whatever level is appropriate, that can be done online again this year. So it's not the pre-pandemic onerous process of having to be there in person in Annapolis. We'll also have faith-based action alerts at various times throughout the session. And so I can share them with you to pass along to the network. That would be a great help. Sharing our legislative briefing with your congregations would be a great way to get people involved. And then if you're really excited about this, and especially if your congregation is in one of those target districts that I shared, we've also been working with congregations on showing the pollution coming off of gas stoves. So we have a handheld nitrogen oxide detector. Nitrogen oxide is one of the types of pollutants that comes off of gas stoves. And doing an education event with a delegate or a senator and a congregation would be a really cool event that we've been exploring. So please let me know if your congregation is in any of those districts.
I think one thing that John and I will do after today's session is sort of begin to sort of map out our list. We have a list of about 185 people in Maryland on our list. So I think we can do some mapping and see where folks are, and then sort of maybe have some sessions with those individuals by district and see if there's ways in which we can do some targeted advocacy and let you know.
That's great.
Suzanne, you have your hand up. Good to see you.
Good to be seen. Thanks, Marvin. Thank you, Jonathan. Really helpful. It was so funny. We were just having this very conversation within the last week. So it just dovetails beautifully with some of the things that have been on our hearts and minds. I think you sort of answered this, but will there be some talking points that we can use, some guidance about how to approach this, not only with our congregations, but also with those folks that we want to target? I think you said that, but I'm just asking for clarification.
Yes, we have a fact sheet that I can share. And yeah, we'll also have some specific action alerts of actions to take at the right time throughout the legislative session.
Thank you. We really find that helpful to put in our church newsletters. Our social action board is always interested in that kind of information for our congregation. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Lacey, do you have a question, or are you just giving a thumbs up to that?
Sorry, no, it was just thumbs up. I agree with that. That would be great to share with our congregations. So
Great. Any final questions, comments for Jonathan? Jonathan,
Great.
be sure to make sure you let us know like of any key dates. As a longtime advocate, I've done most of my work on the federal level, so I know sort of the ins and outs of how things work in Congress. I'm still learning the state of Maryland, and I'm also learning Virginia and a couple of other states that our conference is made up of. Just let us know of any like key dates that we need to be prepared to make sure that, I know that certain bills have to get passed by a certain time so they can cross over, something that I've learned in the last 2 years. So anything that we can do to sort of beat those deadlines and just generate the pressure that's necessary, just let us know those important dates as well as we plan out our efforts and collaborative with you guys.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Appreciate it. We'll be in communication with you and definitely be promoting the briefing that will be coming up later this month. So what I want to do now is give John a few moments to give us an update on our partnership that we have with Interfaith Power and Light, as well as the University of Maryland around developing a air quality monitoring network in DC and Maryland. There's a lot of work that's been happening on this since the fall of last year, and we thought it was important to update you and talk about some next steps. So, John.
All right, well, let me pull my slideshow up here real quick and I'll get into it. All right. So just a quick overview of what the Environmental and Climate Justice Network is within the Justice and Witness Action Network. I don't know how well read those assembled are on the legacy of environmental justice work within the UCC, but it goes back an awfully long way. It got its start in the Commission on Racial Justice in the late 70s, the early 80s, where it had been sort of noticed as a factor of urban planning and economic development that you find more heavily polluting industries in communities of color. You find more toxic waste dumps in communities of color. It was sort of recognized that the stuff that affluent white folks didn't want to deal with got placed out of sight, out of mind, where it was somebody else's problem. And so Ben Chavis, among others, got involved in that work. And in 1987, we put out a report called Toxic Waste and Race, which was a groundbreaking piece of environmental research that found that the odds were pretty good if you were a person of color in America, you lived within a couple of miles of a serious polluting industry. They updated the report in 2007 on the 20-year anniversary. And with the better methods and the benefit of greater time and resources to do the work, found that it wasn't just your odds were higher of being within range of one danger to your health environmentally, but you were within range of multiples, almost guaranteed. And so what we're doing is trying to continue on that legacy established over the last 40, 50 years and taking that into our work that we're doing today. Which brings us to the Air Quality Data Collaborative Project, which we're doing with Interfaith Power and Light and UMD's Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice and Health. And so the target of the program is to fill in a gap where the EPA does what they have to legally, but that doesn't always suffice for tracking particulate matter in the air. Generally, they have to put a monitor within a certain distance of something that's a recognized danger to public health due to its pollution output. But those don't tend to be placed necessarily where they would be the most effective measure of how bad that pollution is. So if you've got a garbage incinerator, for instance, the EPA is required to put a monitor within a certain distance of that incinerator, but they'll pick something that's centrally located to the community. So you'll have an incinerator way out on the edge of town, and the monitor that's supposed to be reporting on what its output is and how serious a risk that is to the community is on City Hall 1.5 miles, 2 miles away. And you don't get reliable reads on what it's like for the people whose backyard backs up to the property for the incinerator. You don't get any indicator of how severe that is on a day-to-day basis, and so the numbers get skewed. Part of what we're trying to do is set up a community science network that can track it on a more granular level, that can get more specific data on specific locations at specific times than what is generally collected by Uncle Sam. And so what that's turned into is collecting a group of volunteer congregations who are willing to host a monitor and participate in a 10-week workshop series on climate science, community science more generally, what it is we're actually testing for, how it is the equipment does that, all that good stuff. So at this point, we've got roughly 20 congregations enrolled as participants. And at the moment, we're awaiting monitor installation. So we've completed our workshop series. Everybody's up to speed. We know how community science works. We know what kind of particulate matter we're testing for. We know what the dangers are to public health. We know why it is that the monitoring that we need isn't necessarily there, but that we can step in and provide it if need be. And we're doing site assessments to try to figure out where on the volunteer congregation's properties a monitor is best placed. You know, like you want to try to avoid putting it right over a parking lot, because all that's going to tell you is, my God, cars pump out a bunch of exhaust, don't they? And so that's, I guess, helpful to know, but not necessarily what we're trying to track. And so we're in the process of gathering data on how to place it most optimally on that property to get readings that don't tell us things we already know, and provide us information that we can use going forward in the legislative process to try to push the State House. If we have this community science network, we can go, okay, we've gathered the data. We know for sure these places, these times on these days, air quality was dramatically worse than the benchmark record we've got. How can we get that addressed? You know, you can speculate then based on where the monitor is placed. Like, for instance, I used to live in Midtown here in Baltimore, around the corner from the Symphony, which is a couple of blocks back from where 83 cuts through the city. And the air quality in that neighborhood was horrific. We had buses going through, stopping all the time. You have all of the exhaust pouring off of the expressway there. And so the general quality of the air in the neighborhood suffers. I mean, I have asthma, and my asthma was dramatically worse when I lived there than it is now that I live in Catonsville. And being able to take that information, not just from our anecdotal experience, but from documentation on paper, means that we can push the State House with the numbers, because, you know, it's all well and good to have people come and testify and tell their stories, but there's something to be said for having the actual data. So what we're looking at installing are these purple air monitors you can see in the bottom right corner. They're a little smaller than like a CCTV camera. You can mount them on a pole, you can mount them on a fence, you can mount them on the building itself. And there aren't really moving parts to speak of. They just take in air as it passes through and track the parts per million for particulate matter that's passing through. We're testing for PM 2.5, so that's very, very tiny microscopic particles that get into your lungs and do damage, coming out of tailpipes, out of chimneys. Basically, if you burn it for power, we're going to track for it. And at this point, we're not quite gathering data yet, but we're testing how we're going to set it up for the pilot site, and then how to get it installed in a speedy fashion for the rest of them. So we're in the process of taking site information from the participating congregations. We're having them submit photos and videos and an aerial map with an idea of like what side of the building faces what way, how do we take advantage of prevailing winds. And the idea is we want to start getting these installed as soon as possible now that we've hit the new year. So here we've got a map of all of our existing partnership congregations. You see it skews a little heavily toward DC down here, but we are doing our best to capture the whole DMV area on the Maryland side of the border, at least. And once we have this in good working order, we're looking at expanding the effort into New Jersey, where we have some interest from congregations there on tracking what sort of pollution burden they're dealing with on the Jersey side of the border from New York City. Siege has some partners up there who are already doing the work, and so it seems like an easy opportunity for us to just slot our folks in and contribute to the effort, because it never hurts to have a larger data set than the one you have right now. So now that we're in 2023, where are we headed? Whoa. Where are we headed? What are we doing? What's the goal? For the network, we're trying to leave it up to the people who constitute the network. You know, like this is where we've started. We're really committed to the idea that air quality monitoring is a worthwhile effort. It's going to really help us combat the actual lived experience of what environmental racism means for a great many of the people in this country. But as we're looking into what we're going to be doing beyond that, it's sort of an open question. Where's the passion among the population that is active in the work? You know, Jonathan made some good points about combating gas stoves in houses. And we talked a little bit about the benefits of community solar programs and offshore energy generation. And as we're looking beyond air quality monitoring, those are things that we really ought to consider as initiatives to follow up on this work with. You know, like now that we have this community network in place, now that we have this information, what is it that we can do legislatively, but also as, you know, community organizers and community activists to try to combat in whatever small way we can the production of that particulate matter that is doing, you know, recognizable harm to people. It's spiking child asthma through the roof. It's increasing the prevalence of cardiovascular disease in people as they age. And we can trace that all back to this particulate matter that we're trying to track its passage through our environment with. So The open question for us is, once we have the numbers, what are we going to do with that, and how are we going to move forward toward combating that with the assistance of the legislature, but recognizing that movement there isn't necessarily always guaranteed. So what can we do ourselves? But that about wraps up what I have to share slide-wise. So if anybody's got any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer.
Any questions for John? Any questions?
Hit me.
Hugh, there you go.
I noticed one of those monitors, I think is at my church, and I didn't even know about it, at Webster Congregational and Harvard of Grace. There's one of those markings that'd be right on top of it.
Yeah, I believe that is you guys.
Yeah, I didn't even know. So we don't even know that it's there. And I'm going to let them know on Sunday. I can tell you that we're part of trying to do some of the monitoring anyway.
Right. Well, we haven't installed it just quite yet, but
Oh, it's not there yet. Oh, but
no,
you got
that's
permission?
part of the effort. We're looking at installing them over the next couple of weeks.
Amen. I'll back you all the way.
Well, I appreciate the support. That's what I like to hear.
Any other questions, comments? John, thank you for your diligence in moving this initiative forward. And I look forward to we look forward rather to engaging those congregations that have signed up for that initiative beyond just having a monitor placed on their property, but to really engage in some advocacy and some additional organizing around both air quality and other environmental and climate justice issues. And
Right.
with that said, we do have an opportunity to do that, and continuing to work and partner with the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Nina Beth Carden, who's the co-founder and director of the campaign, to give us an update on where things stand with the campaign and how we can be engaged in the efforts this year. Nina?
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me back. It's great to see you all. Jonathan and John, it was great to hear your reports. It was really very, very exciting, very inspiring. So I'm delighted to be a part of this. I didn't bring up PowerPoint. I figured I'm tired of PowerPoints. Maybe you are too. I appreciated the PowerPoints that we had because I am a visual learner, but I just thought I would talk to you all. So I hope that's okay. What we want to do is support all of the initiatives that you've been hearing about. The Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights was born because we believe in a fundamental premise that I know you believe in too, that everyone has a right to a healthy environment. I mean, that's just a God-given birthright that we all have. And none of us should be suffering from environmental degradation that is avoidable, that is not necessary, not equitable. And so what we determined several years ago was that we wanted to place in our Constitution, in our Declaration of Rights, an amendment that says that everyone has a right to a healthful environment. And as I think you might remember from the past, this is not a new concept. This is a concept that in fact goes back at least 50 years. There are 5 other states in the United States that have had such provisions in their constitutions for 50 years. There are over 100 countries and dozens of international covenants and contracts and agreements that say that people have a right to a healthful environment. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about the United Nations just this past summer passing a resolution that said that everyone has a right to a healthful environment. So this is not new. And one of the things that an Environmental Human Rights Amendment would say and assert and protect is that everyone intergenerationally has a right to a healthful environment. So just as John was telling us, there should not be, and Jonathan too for that matter, there should not be inequity in who gets harmed by the environment and who does not get harmed by an environment. And there certainly shouldn't be inequity in who gets harmed by the environment by decisions that policymakers make based on inequities of race and wealth. So Environmental Human Rights Amendment would require that everyone is treated equitably and there is intragenerational equity about your engagement with the environment and your response to the environment. But also what an Environmental Human Rights Amendment will require is intergenerational equity. That is, no one generation should have a greater claim to the benefits of an environment than any other generation. So we are the stewards of the environment for our future generations. And it's up to us, therefore, to make sure that our decisions that we make today do not harm those generations that do not have a voice and do not have a seat at the table. So an environmental human rights amendment would be made to protect all of our rights to a healthful environment and the rights of future generations to a healthful environment. Now, as many of you might know, we've been trying to get this Environmental Human Rights Amendment passed in the Maryland legislature for about 5 years. And we have been stymied for a variety of reasons. One of the major reasons being that the chairman of the committee in which this amendment goes, which is the Environment and Transportation Committee of the House, is dead set against this amendment. So that is already a huge obstacle that we would have to overcome. And so for 5 years, we've been trying to get this Environmental Human Rights Amendment passed. You have been enormously helpful. The faith community in general has been enormously helpful. We have had 3,000 people sign on to support the amendment, hundreds of organizations sign on for the amendment, an incredible outpouring of support last year. Still didn't make the cut. We still didn't get out of committee. For a variety of reasons, we're saying this year we're going to take a step back. We have to take a pause for a couple of reasons. One, in general, the General Assembly doesn't like to consider constitutional amendment bills in off-cycle years. One of the reasons being that in order to get a constitutional amendment passed, you have to get it passed by 3/5 of both houses, and then it has to go to the referendum at the next general election. And if you don't have an election this year, you don't have to deal with the bill this year because there's always next year. And I think the rule of thumb in the General Assembly, because they have so many bills and so many demands every year, is like, why do you have to take up this year something that you can put off till next year? So they don't like to take constitutional provisions under consideration unless it is an election year. So this is not an election year now. So we're not going to be entertaining the bill now for that one reason. But in addition, there are so many new legislators whom we have to create relationships with. And we also have to figure out how to get around our obstacle in the Environment and Transportation Committee. So we decided to take a step back and try to figure out, okay, what do we do and how do we regroup? How do we continue to move the train forward at the same time that we are pausing and not introducing a bill to promote the Environmental Human Rights Amendment? And the answer came to us through a story. As I mentioned, the United Nations General Assembly just this past summer passed a resolution that finally acknowledged that everyone has a right to a healthful environment. It took them, by the way, 50 years. They started on that path in 1972. So we shouldn't, that we've been working for 5 years and haven't succeeded should not get us to, upset. I hope it won't take 50 years, but we should be able to make good progress. Anyway, it took them about 50 years. What's interesting is that a year before the General Assembly passed that resolution, the United Nations Human Rights Council considered that resolution. The Human Rights Council passed that resolution, but they passed the resolution against the wishes of the United States. When the Human Rights Council considered whether or not everyone has a right to a healthful environment, the United States, which was not sitting on the Human Rights Council, so it couldn't vote, nonetheless voiced its opposition to that resolution. And a year later, last summer, when the resolution came to the General Assembly, the United States voted for that resolution. So I went to a couple people who were involved in the United States decision, and I said, how did you get the United States to change its mind? How did you get the United States to go from no to yes? And besides that, how did you get to all these other nations to support this resolution? Because the resolution was passed 161 to nothing. 161 to nothing in the General Assembly of the United Nations. That's almost unheard of. There were about 6 abstentions, Russia, China, Syria among them. But even they didn't have the nerve, as it were, to vote against that resolution. So there was nobody voting against the resolution. So I said, how did you do that? And they said, we basically reminded everybody that this is a not legally binding resolution. It's not legally binding. Well, that wasn't too encouraging to me at first, because I'm going, okay, but an environmental rights amendment, you want to be legally binding. So how is that going to help me? So I had the follow-up question, which is the question you have to ask. Well, if it's not legally binding, why bother doing it? And they said, because it puts down a marker in the international community. It establishes a moral obligation in the international community. And that means that residents across the world can go to their governments now and say, you know, that resolution that you voted for, it is time to put that into practice in law. So it serves as a moral obligation. As this wonderful woman, Edith Brown Weiss, wrote, she said, recognition of moral obligations is a prelude, a stage in the evolution of the public conscience, which leads to legal obligations and rights. So we said, I think we have our pathway forward. Let me take one step back and then I'm going to come back here. I hope that you're following me with this. Okay, so we have the United Nations teaching of how we can create a non-legally binding resolution that can hold people's better angels, pull people's better angels forward to acknowledge that we all have this fundamental right as a God-given birthright to all of us, while it's not legally binding, and that sort of removes some of the trappings that the opposition might have. And the other thing is that in 1973, in the state of Maryland, the General Assembly passed a law, which is the Maryland Environmental Policy Act, which said each person has a fundamental and inalienable right to a healthful environment. So on the books of the state of Maryland for 50 years now has been a law, the Maryland Environmental Policy Act, which asserted that each person has a fundamental and inalienable right to a healthful environment. And it said that all of the agencies of the state have to create what they called methods and procedures to implement that right. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. The Maryland Department of the Environment didn't even exist in 1973. Since then, Maryland Department of the Environment, Department of Agriculture, the Department of Natural Resources, many of the other departments have never created those methods and procedures to implement this right that is on the books in the state of Maryland. So what we're doing this year is taking a page from the book of the United Nations, and we have created a resolution that marks the 50th anniversary of MEPA, this Maryland Environmental Policy Act, marks the 50th anniversary, reaffirms what MEPA said, reaffirms the fact that each person has a fundamental and inalienable right to a healthful environment, and calls upon the state to, in fact, enact what MEPA has asked them to enact for 50 years. There is no enforcement clause in MEPA, so nobody can sue the state for not enforcing it. And now that we have a new administration, we believe that we can probably make some progress, and the new administration can turn to its new leadership in its agencies and say, yes, let's enforce MEPA and create these new methods and procedures or rules and regulations that will in fact implement the thrust of this fundamental right that Maryland has decided we all have, 50 years ago. We have a House sponsor, Delegate Regina Boyce, from 43A in Baltimore, who is going to be our House sponsor. We are working on our Senate sponsor now. What's unusual about it, as I say, is that it's a bill which is a resolution, not legally binding on the one hand. On the other hand, if we can establish this reaffirmation of this fundamental moral obligation and put into play the administrative regulatory wheels that will in fact implement this right, it will help us, it'll help move us forward enormously. Not everything has to go through the legislature. We can't get everything done if we go through the legislature. I don't know if many of you were part of the Eastern Shore legislative webinars that they had this past Saturday and Sunday. Enormous number of wonderful environmental bills. But as Marvin was saying, there is this unspoken understanding in Annapolis that each area of law can really only get a couple bills passed. So if you've got 40, 50 bills from the environment, you're only going to get like 3 or 4 maybe passed. Not because they don't all deserve to be passed, not even because all the legislators don't want to work on passing them, but just because they don't have the time. We can't do everything through the legislature. We have to do other things in a regulatory fashion. And if we do that, and we get the resolution passed, and the new administration, it turns to its agencies and says, let's implement MEPA and create those new rules and regulations, methods and procedures that will begin to implement this fundamental right that everyone has to a healthy environment. That then lays a foundation for us to come back next year or the next election year with the Environmental Human Rights Amendment and say, you know what, we've got to take this one step further. We've got to make sure that everything we do, every policy we make, every bill that we consider is held up against this Environmental Human Rights Amendment in our Constitution to see, does it pass muster with that amendment? And the amendment would give the people on the front line what the United Nations calls the rights bearers, the legal power to protect themselves against environmental degradation, which is a power they do not have now. They do not have that sufficiently now. And the amendment would make sure that everybody could fight for the right to a healthful environment. So that's what we're all about. We would love you to sign up to continue to receive or begin to receive our emails. We're going to have a petition online very soon so that you can support this. You can share, Marvin will send you more information. You can share this with everyone to help them share it with their congregations. This is a numbers game, as in so many other bills. It's a numbers game. The more people we can get to show that they support this, the more the legislature will be inclined to support this. So, and again, it's not legally binding. All those people who came out against us because they didn't like the legal aspect of it can't come out against us like that. This is now simply a moral statement that we're asking them to endorse, which has been stated by the state of Maryland 50 years ago. So this should not be a controversial issue. So we'll see whether it becomes one or not.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you. That was good. That was good. And I like the strategy. And I'm hoping it will be effective. And hopefully we can be a part of making it effective by participating in this year's efforts with you guys. Questions folks have? Questions. You always have one. Let's go.
I always have one. I'm sorry. It's because I'm manic. Nina, you said that doing other things is important. And I found that out 2 years ago when my former seminary, Bangor Theological Seminary, had closed and had formed the BTS Center. And I've mentioned it before. And I wonder how many of you have bothered to go to btscenter.org on your computers. It's another M state like Maryland, Maine, and they made something out of the seminary. It's very active, and it has a convocation each year, and for no money, practically you can get their newsletter, and it's doing something else that's helped me to get back in touch. That's the reason I'm here at this committee meeting, is because 2 years ago I went to the convocation. Last year I went to it. They had 125 people on Zoom. And even one of the guest speakers was from London, England, coast to coast. And I can't encourage you enough to at least try that website and see what the BTS Center is. Thank goodness the UCC, in its wisdom, didn't just let the seminary die. They made something better out of it. And that's what it is. And boy, there are a lot of people up there working hard. And we could work together. Maybe. Thank you. My commercial's over.
Thank you, Hugh.
I just to respond, you're absolutely right, Hugh, and John was absolutely right. I mean, you guys know this, that UCC, in some measure, launched the environmental justice movement in the United States. And it certainly made many of us aware of it. And people in the know this. I mean, this is not just something that UCC tells itself. This is something that the environmental justice movement knows as part of its history. And yes, BTS is a great organization. And when you say go, just make sure everybody understands, it's online. Those conventions now are online. So you can just go from the comfort of your own home, and they do amazing things. I have been in touch with some of the faculty there. They do amazing things. You're absolutely right, Hugh.
But if you're in Portland, I have the address, and I'll be glad to share with you how to get right to the building.
Thanks. Any other questions for Nina?
I have something I wanted to bring up. It's not specific to anything we kind of discussed tonight, but I live in an apartment and well, okay, so two things, I guess. One thing is we get a lot of people that come here with the different energy groups trying to have the apartment people, not the landlords, but to have the residents switch over to different things. So that was really interesting to hear about Jonathan with the fossil fuels things. The last one that just came, they just tried to get us to switch. They said, you're going to get a rebate and we'll give you these energy saving light bulbs. And that was kind of their, how they encouraged us. So that was one thing since being here. But the other thing that I've heard, and I don't know if it's true, but when I moved here, one of the things they had in the advertisement of this apartment complex was that they recycle. And then I didn't see a recycling bin by our trash dumpster, but then as I looked around more in the community, I did see recycling bins. My roommate, we're not very far from Baltimore, and my roommate said that she has a friend who is a garbage man, and he is in Baltimore, and he said that they actually just pick up the recycling and throw it in the regular trash. They don't actually divide it out. My parents are in Iowa, and my mom said that she caught the garbage people there doing the same exact thing, and she confronted them, and she called their company or whatever, and another day they were doing the same thing. So I'm just wondering if that really is an issue of maybe, people not really recycling, and how we can check on that and hold people accountable for that, I guess.
Looks like Nina has a response to that.
Yeah, I spoke to one of our delegates, I think it was last year or so, and he said a couple things. And since then, I've learned even more disturbing things. First of all, maybe 15% of our recycling actually gets recycled for a variety of reasons, maybe 15%. Second of all, I cannot remember the film, I don't know, maybe Jonathan, maybe you do, but there's a film that talks about recycling. And in fact, most everything, sadly, that has those chasing arrows on it are not recyclable. And we think that they are recyclable, and we dutifully put it in the recycling bin. So I hate to say, Lacey, but even if those things were not dumped in their normal trash, which I think many of them are, they might be rejected at the recycling spot because they are not recyclable. Jonathan, who has the bill coming up this year? Do you know about the appropriate recycling markings? Do you know who's got that?
The recycling markings. I'm not sure on that one.
Yeah, so there is a bill that I just learned about that is coming up, which is saying we have to get these recycling, it's like truth in recycling markings or something. So, and as we know now, recycling was promoted by the industries to offset, right, to put onto us the obligation and responsibility to manage their waste. And so the again, Jonathan, I'm going to turn to you. The what is it? The Producer Responsibility Act. What is that? Actually, that Delegate Learman, was promoting. What is that one?
I also don't remember the exact title. You're close, I think. Yeah.
Right. So it's basically the producers will be held responsible for the packaging and the garbage that they are thrusting on to us now, and not just us, but onto the taxes that we have to pay, because it is our governments that have to do the pickup and to do the recycling. But if the producers are responsible for the packaging and the waste that they force us to create, and they have to then take that back or somehow manage it better or reduce it, then they will, because it's on their dime, they're going to be more responsible about that. So recycling is a huge thing, and we should not accept even saying, oh, we have to get to 100% recycling. We should not have to be doing this. We should be building our merchandise better.
And it's interesting with you saying that too. I did see, I don't remember if it was a little video or an article, and they mentioned that they're like, when you hear those statistics, like you were saying, like only 15% maybe of everything gets actually recycled. They're like, well, people then might feel, well, should I even bother? Should I even recycle at all? But they're like, no, because that 15% is still being recycled. And so we need you to still, contribute and try, even though it's such a small amount.
Yeah. Any other final questions before we move to the next part of the agenda? I don't want to dismiss Nina put in the chat. The campaign is having a resolution briefing on January 24th. So the link is there in the chat. Encourage you to sign up and get the Zoom information so you can learn more about the resolution that she discussed in her presentation that will hopefully get not only attention this year, but hopefully gets through both chambers and goes to the governor's desk. All right. All right. So what we want to do is sort of begin to wrap up our time. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time just sort of talking about sort of where do we go next with this work. Just as a reminder, back in December of this year, as part of our Building Power retreat, we had an opportunity to gather together some of you and others who couldn't make it this evening to discuss our priorities. And coming out of that conversation, we agreed that environmental climate justice would be our priority for our work in Maryland this year. So we were very happy and pleased with that because it connects well with the work that John and others are doing across the conference. And what we're trying to do is work with a small set of you as a organizing team who can help us mobilize our churches to take actions on these very priorities that were discussed tonight, both by Jonathan, by John, and by Nina. So there will be some follow-up work that we will do to gather another session to talk about how do we now move forward with our strategies and our plans around these particular initiatives. Much of our work this year, which we want to make sure that you are aware of, is really going to be about how do we show up in Annapolis. I think it was good that we took advantage of technology as best as we could during the pandemic. But a lot of this work in terms of legislative advocacy requires us to show up in Annapolis. That includes showing up for any direct actions that may take place and be organized right in Annapolis in Lawyers Mall, or any other area, particularly in a legislative district that is important to the work that we're doing. It requires us, as Jonathan mentioned, to show up and submit testimony as part of the hearings for these pieces of legislation. And I'm glad that it is still convenient that we can submit that information online rather than going through the arduous process of standing in a line and being present down in Annapolis physically, but we can be there and be a part of the hearings as well. And it also requires us to do the action alert, showing up and making sure that we do lobby visits where those are necessary. And also doing the online advocacy as well, i.e. Twitter, because most legislators now are using Twitter as a means of communication. And many advocates over the last 3 or 4 years have been very effective in using Twitter in particular with getting their message out and organizing and mobilizing the public to express their support or opposition to the work that's being done down in Annapolis. So we want to make sure that we show up, not just show up for these sessions to learn and hear from our partners and their leaders of the issues that we're working on, but to show up and do the actual work and to bring others with us in our local churches. So one of the things we're going to be sending out tomorrow is this recording to our entire Maryland list of 185 members. And we want to encourage you to sort of pass that email along so they can receive this briefing, but not only that, to sign up for the information, sign up for the campaign in particular, as well as be prepared to take action at those critical moments where we're called to do that as part of this particular work. So just wanted to make sure that you understand what our campaign and efforts are going to be about this year. And then also something that John and I will be focusing a lot of our attention on, even in the midst of the legislative session, is setting up some one-on-one visits with each local church, your pastor and or your team or committee, whatever you call it, that is responsible for facilitating the church's work in justice. So we can be there and be in conversation with you and to listen about what your priorities are, where you are in terms of doing the work of justice, and to be supportive to build relationships so we can continue to do this work together. So I wanted to see if there's any final questions or thoughts or reactions to our plans or efforts this year before we finish up our time this evening. Any final thoughts, questions, any final things you want to share? John, Jonathan, Nina?
No, just that I'm looking forward to talking to you when you let me talk to you. So let us know when we can do those one-on-ones. I want to hear.
Yeah, I just, Marvin and Rebecca, I just want to thank you so much for inviting me back and continuing to walk this walk with us. We are trying to change the way people understand our relationship to nature and the legal responsibility to protect the environment. And that's not easy to do. So it's going to take a sea change of attitude, a sort of a reawakening of spirit. And it's going to take a little while, but just keep with us, because that message is critical to make sure that we have the motivation, legislators have the motivation to do what needs to be done over the future years, because it's going to be difficult for all of us. And we just got to make sure that we do it with wholeheartedly, because we truly believe this is the right thing to do to protect everyone's right to a healthful environment. So thanks so much.
All right. Any final word, Jonathan?
I'll echo that. Thanks for all of your work, and just reiterate that you all have a powerful voice in the legislative process. Legislators care when they hear from people of faith and faith leaders, and they recognize the kind of moral authority that your words and positions can hold. So your voice is an important one during the General Assembly.
Thank you. So we're gonna close it up. Hugh, I see you have something to say, but I'm gonna go ahead and close out this session. You can give me a call if you want to talk about
all
a few things.
Okay.
And I want to just thank all of you for taking time out of your schedule this evening to be on this session. Again, we'll follow up by email with the recording and what our next steps are going to be. And one of those next steps will be to officially sign up for this campaign, as well as join us at our next meeting as we begin to talk strategy and prepare for our actions. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, John. We'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.